the ultimate family franchise. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be ranking the 11 films of the Fast and Furious franchise as part of my franchise Rankography series. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. So what is a rankography exactly? Well, it's my ranking of a filmography, whether that be a director's output, an actor's appearances, or even an entire franchise. My rankographies are based on personal preference, and I rank movies according to how much I enjoyed them, rather than any specific technical merit or attribute. Remember, this is just my ranking, not the ranking, so be sure to post your own personal ranking of the Fast and Furious franchise in the comments below. 11 films in 22 years, and this franchise somehow still hasn't run out of gas. At this point, we are far beyond the humble beginnings of this series, and well past the point of reasonableness. I recognize that the movies of this franchise can't really hold up to much scrutiny under a traditional critical lens, because they are so ridiculous. But there's something about this franchise that just works, especially when you've been invested in this set of characters for decades. It's definitely a series that's got its fair share of issues, and there are some films I'm not the biggest fan of, but it's also just a lot of big, dumb, ridiculous fun that never fails to entertain me. It's been an absurd journey, but one that I keep happily coming back to. I've already reviewed all 11 of these movies on this channel, so if you want to check those out for some more in-depth thoughts on each of them, I'll put links in the description below, and also link some of them up in the cards as we go along. Alright, let's get this rankography started. Coming in at number 11, The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift. This is definitely the black sheep of the Fast and Furious family, even more so than the spin-off film. It's by far the biggest outlier from the rest of the franchise. The style, the drifting, the teen focus, the lack of main franchise characters. This movie has since been pulled back in and had its story worked into the main timeline of the franchise in a kind of clever way, but it definitely still sticks out. And I think that's a big part of what makes this arguably the most divisive film in the franchise. Not many people are going to have it in the middle of their ranking. It's either going to be at the bottom or pretty close to the top. And obviously, now you know where it falls for me. Interestingly enough, this was actually the first Fast and Furious movie I ever saw. When I was a junior in college, me and my roommates used to have a fairly regular movie night as sort of an apartment bonding thing. One of my roommates was a really big car guy, so he chose this as our movie one week, and I can't say I was very impressed. Even a few years later, watching the entirety of the franchise in sequence, then only 4 movies, I still actively disliked this one. So even though it's still in last place on this list, I've got to say, over the years, it's certainly grown on me. I don't get quite the same enjoyment out of it as the other movies, but I don't dislike it anymore. The teen-oriented story is still pretty lackluster for me, and I think most of the characters are iffy, but what this film does have going for it is Han. He's easily the best character in this film, and also, obviously, the way in which this film was eventually able to be tied into the rest of the franchise. Coming in at number 10, Fast and Furious. So this is the 4th film in the franchise, and I have to admit, whenever I go a while between rewatches of this franchise and I look at my ranking, I'm always surprised by the placement of this one. I think it's an error, because how could it be this low? We get the reunion of much of the family, and really our first continuation of the main storyline since the first movie. We get to see Han in his first chronological timeline appearance, we're introduced to Giselle. It starts off with the amazing and ridiculous gas heist, and we can't forget the insanity of the tunnels. So I always look at it so low in my ranking and think I just haven't updated this in a while or something. And so I rewatch it, and am quickly reminded of exactly why it's so low. The story of this one is just so dull. This is the one movie in the franchise that, despite having seen it a number of times, I never seem to be able to remember very much about it. I get bits and pieces, but then start to conflate it with some of the other movies. I remember the stunts, but the story? I don't know exactly what it is about this one, but it's remarkably forgettable for me. Maybe it's because the Letty stuff feels so melodramatic and convoluted. Maybe it's because the revenge storyline or the drug cartel angle just feel overfamiliar and generic. The story's just very bland for me, but luckily, the family reunion and definitely the action helped to still make this a somewhat enjoyable movie for me. This film is sort of a fulcrum point in the franchise. It takes itself pretty seriously, but it's right on the precipice of going completely ridiculous with the action. So there's still some decent fun to be had with it, like watching Dom doing a wheelie in a Camaro with an F-bomb decal on the side. Coming in at number 9, Too Fast, Too Furious. I would say that after Tokyo Drift, this is probably the next most divisive film in the franchise. And I guess that's not too surprising, since they were both essentially spin-offs packaged as main franchise films. I know I've still got this fairly low on the list, but I have to say, I do really enjoy this movie. Probably a bit more than most other people. So yeah, it's in the number 9 spot, but let's just say there's a decent gap between the 9th and 10th spots for me. Still, I understand people's complaints with this one. No Vin Diesel, the street racing is scaled back from the first, though at this point that's an issue that's pretty moot. The story's not particularly meaningful, and Brian's the only thing that really connects it to the previous film. But for me, this movie is just a ton of fun. Some of the later franchise films get a bit silly, but so many of these movies, especially early on, are very self-serious. So there's something extra enjoyable about having a more lighthearted entry that knows how ridiculous these movies are and has fun with it. It's bright and colorful and campy and self-aware. It pokes fun at some of its own absurdity and has probably the most comedic tone overall of any of the main franchise films. There are a lot of jokes, but there's also a lot of very entertaining situational humor too. Plus, it introduces two characters, Roman and Tej, who have continued to inject this franchise with comedy and fun for another 2 decades now. It's not the weightiest film, and it's got some pretty laughable CGI during the races, but it's always just such a fun movie to watch. Coming in at number 8, The Fate of the Furious. I actually went back and forth for a while on my placement of this one. I decided to put it in the number 8 slot today, but this could have just as easily gone in the 6th or 7th spot for me. Out of all the films in this franchise, 6, 8, and 9 are definitely the 3 closest for me. And I guess that kind of makes sense, because they do have some very similar elements. Obviously, all of the films are tied to one another, but Fast 6 started a multi-film story arc that really only became apparent as each new film was released. In this 8th installment, we've got plenty more of the techie covert ops stuff that got its start in 6, and we also see the return of some characters, as well as the expected ramp-up of action insanity. As always seems to be the case with this franchise, the action here is incredibly entertaining. Unbelievably ridiculous, but incredibly entertaining. We've got fiery races, zombie cars, bare-handed torpedo redirects, and even somebody getting kicked into a propeller. Most of the stunts were done practically, as usual for these films, but I can't help but be disappointed by the CG backgrounds, which really pull me out of some of these sequences and dampen my usual excitement about the action. The story here is decently solid. I like the idea of a rogue character, and still think it had a lot of potential in this movie, but I think the execution left something to be desired. The film gave us, as the audience, way too much information from the start, and it was a major missed opportunity to craft a suspenseful and answer-seeking story. It took itself a bit too seriously, and although this film had a bit of emotional momentum coming off of Furious 7, it takes it way too far, and ends up turning the family theme from one of its greatest assets into a big, sappy, melodramatic detriment. Coming in at number 7, F9. As I mentioned with the last film in the ranking, this one comes in really close with Fast 6 and Fate for me. This movie actually has a lot to like, but this one is very much a middle-of-the-pack Fast and Furious movie for me. The story here, much like many of its immediate predecessors, is quite convoluted, and overloaded with techie save-the-world stuff. Like Fate of the Furious, I think this one suffers from having too many villains. And even though I think John Cena works pretty well in this Fast and Furious universe, I still think he was a bit miscast in this particular role. Luckily, despite its story conveniences and messy script, or perhaps in part because of them, F9 delivers exactly what you would expect from a late stage installment of this franchise. Reality, logic, and feasibility went out the window a decade ago, so we're left with this incredibly stupid but ridiculously entertaining popcorn action blockbuster series that perpetually one-ups itself, and F9 one-ups Fate of the Furious. If you thought zombie cars and bare-handed torpedo redirects were ridiculous, just wait until you see the new heights the action gets launched to here. The action is as fun as ever, but perhaps more satisfying is the return to form we see for the family elements. There are some great cameos, reunions, and new additions that feel central to the plot without falling into the same overly sappy and melodramatic territory as its predecessor. Coming in at number 6, Fast and Furious 6. Coming immediately on the heels of Fast 5, this movie had some really big shoes to fill, and I think it managed to successfully fill one of the two shoes. Keeping with tradition in this franchise, this movie goes even bigger on just about every front. The side of that really works is the action. This movie was already well into the throw logic out the window and just go as ridiculous as possible phase of this franchise's action, so it delivers on some very memorable and entertaining stunts. There are cars and tanks, people flying through the air, leaping headbutts, shootouts, chases, and a 26-mile-long runway. Everything is ramped up to absurd levels, and even though some of the stunts in the previous film were pretty ridiculous, this is the movie where our characters seem to spawn superhuman abilities. I think this movie does a fairly good job with handling the family theme that's ever present in the franchise. The crew's together, there's some decent character development, and there are a number of pretty emotional sequences. One aspect related to the family side of things is a little convoluted, just as it was in its previous appearance back in the fourth film, but it's admittedly handled better this time around. So what about that second shoe I mentioned before? The one that wasn't filled? Well, that empty shoe is entirely due to the plot. It's fun and it's entertaining, but it's a big jump when compared to the stories of all of the previous films. Our characters had always been kind of a ragtag group of criminals. Street racing, stealing stuff, they did it in progressively more insane ways, but they were still reasonably believable characters. This film puts them up against Owen Shaw, who's effectively a supervillain, and so the group has to suddenly take on this techie covert ops thing to save the world. Like I said, it's fun, but a pretty big change in direction. Coming in at number 5, Fast X. This 10th film in the main franchise lands itself just about in the middle of the overall ranking. From a story perspective, it's reminiscent of things we've seen before. The family's in danger and need to go on the run in order to stay safe and clear their names. But unlike the previous films with the same basic setup, we now have 2 decades of character build-up to give us emotional footing. The whole family thing may come across as a bit of an overplayed joke at times throughout the franchise, but it's surprisingly earnest here. These characters have grown and matured a lot over the years, and their priorities have shifted some, so protecting little Brian is key for Dom. This movie gives us that strong family core, but keeps things entertaining in classic Fast and Furious fashion. The action here is incredibly fun, with some huge set pieces. There's some wild car chases, huge crashes, big fist fights, and plenty of absurd moments, but it does feel a bit reined in from the off-the-rails absurdity of some of the stunts in F9, giving it a slightly more grounded feel, in the context of Fast and Furious at least, if that's possible. The film suffers a bit from being the first part of a multi-part film, with a very abrupt ending and incomplete feeling, but the heart and action keep it exciting, as does Jason Momoa's unhinged and bizarrely entertaining villain, Dante. He's basically the Joker and Jack Sparrow mashed up to play the role of a Bond villain, but somehow it really works. Coming in at number 4, Hobbs and Shaw. So even though Too Fast, Too Furious and Tokyo Drift were spin-off films in spirit, Hobbs and Shaw is the only official spin-off as of right now, and I initially went back and forth on whether or not to include it in the ranking, but I decided to include it because it is part of the franchise, even if it's not part of the central core Fast Saga storyline. Besides, it doesn't really affect the order of anything else in this ranking anyway. That said, I'll admit it's a little tough to compare it to the main films simply because of how over the top it is. I realize how dumb that sounds when talking about a franchise that's literally comprised of over-the-top films, but this one goes a few extra steps further than even the later main films have ever dared, barring perhaps the brief journey to space. This movie is so self-aware. It never quite goes to the point where it feels like it's parodying the franchise, but it continuously pokes fun at itself and the absurdity of everything that's happening. This one really plays up the superhero idea that the franchise has been flirting with since the sixth film, and straight up gives the characters a supervillain to deal with. I mean, I thought Owen Shaw was very supervillainy, but he's nothing compared to Brixton. The stunts here are insane, but as per usual, they're ridiculously fun to watch. And even though the story feels a little contrived at points and overemphasizes its attempts at sentimental moments a bit, this is an incredibly fun, enjoyable movie. Hobbs and Shaw exhibited some entertaining chemistry and banter in the eighth movie, and this film just runs with it, resulting in not only the most comedic film in the franchise, but also a really action-packed one too. Coming in at number 3, The Fast and the Furious. Alright, so we've got the one that started it all. It's always kind of funny looking back on this one now, because I just know that absolutely nobody, not the cast, not the crew, not audiences sitting in that theater, would have ever guessed where this franchise would be 22 years later. I doubt many expected this to even spawn a franchise, let alone one that would still be going strong after 2 decades. But the evolution that's occurred over these 22 years is even more surprising and unbelievable. This was just a little racing movie. It was basically a ripoff of Point Break, and had a bunch of 20-something-year-olds hanging out, driving fast, and stealing DVD players. I mean, this is a movie where the biggest spectacle of an action set piece is a drag race and a solitary car crash. It might not seem like much now, and honestly, it's barely even recognizable as the same franchise at this point, but I still think this is easily one of the most solid entries in the series. Like I said, the story is basically Point Break, but that's a decent story. It's really easy to follow and refreshingly simple when compared to the craziness that would come later in the franchise. And this movie serves another extremely important role. It establishes these characters. We get new additions with each new film, but the core 4, Brian, Mia, Dom, and Letty, are integral to this family. And this movie did a surprisingly good job of setting these characters up and providing this sense of believability and realism to all their relationships. Without that emotional family core, I don't think this would have been a successful franchise. And to think, it all started with a tuna on white, no crust. Coming in at number 2, Furious 7. Of the later films in the franchise, this movie is a bit of an outlier, but in a good way. It's well into the second era of the franchise, so it's definitely a movie that's big and ridiculous and over the top. It's also right in the middle of the multi-film story arc that started with Fast 6, so there's a certain degree of complexity when it comes to the plot and how it interweaves with the other movies. That could have posed a bit of a problem, because much like those other movies, this does have an excessively technological storyline. But amazingly, it manages to find the right balance with just about everything. With the story, the characters, the tone, the action, the emotion, just about everything here clicks into place in a way that hasn't quite been replicated since. The action here is absolutely unreal. While it doesn't have my all-time favorite franchise action sequence, I would say that overall, as a whole film, this is definitely the best the franchise's action has been. We've got the parachute sequence and the whole extended chase that follows, the tri-tower jump, the Ramsey keep-away sequence. On top of that, we've also got the best antagonist this franchise has ever offered, Deckard Shaw. And if all of that wasn't enough to cement this as one of the best installments in the franchise, it hits us with the strongest emotional core of any of the movies. This film certainly has a little something extra on that front since it was Paul Walker's final movie, but I do think the story and family themes here still would have been a highlight even without the added legacy. So that means my number 1 Fast and Furious movie is Fast 5. Who would have thought that a middle movie in a ridiculous action franchise would still be the best? But man, this movie is basically an encapsulation of all the things I like about this franchise. I consider this film to be the beginning of the second era of the franchise. It finally hit a point where the action and just general story couldn't be considered plausible anymore. And making that kind of jump was a huge risk, but it paid off so well. This film absolutely nails its tone. It doesn't have the silly irreverence that Hobbs and Shaw or even Too Fast, Too Furious have, but it also doesn't take itself too seriously either. It knows that it's ridiculous. It knows that it needs to be fun, but doesn't throw away a strong and somewhat meaningful story in the process. If the fourth film served as a reunion, this fifth one solidified the family dynamic by pulling in characters from every previous movie. We get the core four from the original movie, Roman and Tej make their first appearance since the second film, Hans pulled in from the third, and Giselle from the fourth. So we get the benefit of the family, and then there's some entertaining campiness that comes from the intensity of Hobbs and his introduction to this franchise. This one also has easily my favorite plot in the franchise. It's a heist film, which is an inherently fun genre, so combining that with Fast and Furious in a one last job type of story was just a recipe for success and entertainment. And speaking of entertainment, the action here is so much fun. It actually still has some stunts that could pass for plausible, but it's when the laws of physics are finally thrown out the window that this film really shines, with my favorite sequence of the entire franchise, the vault chase. Alright, so that's my rankography of the Fast and Furious franchise. 11 movies, 1 family, and not a single law of physics in sight. What does your ranking look like? I'd love to see some reasoning for your order, so be sure to post it in the comments below. Remember, I've already reviewed all 11 of these movies, so you could check those videos out if you want some more in-depth discussion of each, as well as my ratings, pros and cons, and even tailored film recommendations. And if you're interested in buying any of these movies, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this rankography, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe here at it to see more videos like this, as well as movie reviews. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies. The way life should be.